Hello, everyone. I am back with the candidates round 3 recap. And as you can see, I have my Twitch channel up here. Make sure to go and drop a follow at twitch.tv/stevis5. And I'd also appreciate if you subscribed to my YouTube channel. Alright, let's get a look at the games here. Okay. So the first game I'm going to take a look at from round 3 once again is this game between Timur Radjabov and Jan Nepomniachtchi. Went d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, d5, and g3, the Catalan. So often in recent games, Radjabov has played into the Queen's Gambit declined. This was a game in the Rogozin that Radjabov played against Anand in the Norway Chess Blitz tournament, which happened only a few weeks ago. But in this game, we got a Catalan dc4, and Nepomniachtchi has actually never played this before. He normally plays bishop e7, but some think that maybe this was leftover candidates prep, or sorry, World Championship prep, since Magnus Carlsen, the world champion that Nepomniachtchi faced last year in their match, he tends to play the Catalan quite a bit. So probably something that Nepomniachtchi looked at for that match. So we got here bishop g2, c5, and here castles was played. Radjabov had another game where he played queen a4 check, but castles is pretty standard. And here we got sort of a, I would say, boring line. White does have ways to fight for the advantage here, but most games at a higher level are drawn. Because it is pretty balanced. We get an early queen trade. Black is a little worse, mostly based on the activity of these two bishops. The Catalan bishop is on this long diagonal and is very strong, whereas the c8 bishop is locked in and won't really have anywhere active to go, so eventually it's going to try to trade itself off. We got some more moves. Nepomniachtchi plays c3, trying to break up Radjabov's pawn structure. And here we get a bunch of trades. There are other moves like bishop g5 that sort of fight for an advantage more. I think Radjabov was okay with a draw in this game, to be completely honest. And you can see it's already basically equal at this point. And I think that's probably because Nepomniachtchi was a co-leader with Caruana after 2 rounds on 1.5 out of 2. So it's very logical to be okay with a draw against him, even with white. Also, I should say that Nepomniachtchi beat Ding with white, so he can be a dangerous player, of course, even with black. So we got some more trades here, and at this point it's a pretty dead-drawn endgame. Just a rook endgame, equal pawns, and pretty quickly the players made a repetition and agreed to a draw. So not the most interesting game. Nepomniachtchi preserved his lead, while Radjabov stays on -1. If you recall, he lost to Nakamura in round 2, but he's still in it, and I guess he decided that Nepomniachtchi is just not the right opponent to take risks against. So the next game we're going to look at here, actually let's save that one for later. Let's look at this game between Caruana and Duda. So Caruana played e4, we got c5, a Sicilian, and here we got a Najdorf. And so Caruana chose to play f3, which he hasn't actually played in 4 years. If you remember, f3 was, or wait a minute, actually no, I think this is the first time that f3 was played in the candidates. I'm getting confused because it was played in a round 4 game. I'm recording this as round 4 has already happened, but I'll get into that when I do my round 4 recap. So Yeah, so this was the first time this was played in the candidates. There's some other moves in this position, like bishop g5, and I actually noticed in the database that Caruana had a lot of games against Duda where he played h4 from a speed chess championship match 2 years ago. But in this game, he played f3, we got e5, knight b3, bishop e6, bishop e3, and the move h5, which is quite trendy because it stops white's idea of going g4. So we got castle's queenside. Here, knight d5 is a little more standard, but castle's queenside was played, bishop e7, king b1, b5, and now knight d5 is played. And this is a little rare. Usually black is considered okay. So I think a lot of people were wondering if this was part of Caruana's prep. Maybe he looked at this and found some idea that computers or other top players don't recognize at first. So we got some trades, knight b6, putting pressure on d5. So that's captured. And now knight a5, trying to plant the knight on c6. But now after knight c6, we get some trades here. This after queen takes d5, there's queen takes c6, so Caruana takes on e7. And this endgame is basically equal. There are some different ways to play it, and there are some Lenier Dominguez games in the database here, who Dominguez, of course, being one of Caruana's seconds. So some thought maybe Caruana looked at this with Dominguez and found some kind of creative idea to play for a win. Here he played the move rook d2, which Dominguez has played in some of his games. There's another setup here with maybe c3 and rook d1. This is another way to place your pieces, but it's all pretty equal. So rook d2, king e7, bishop d3. We got rook h d8, rook h d1, and here g6 was played, just holding together this nice pawn structure, pawn chain. One of the Dominguez games continued rook c7 in this position against Nepomniachtchi. And that game was eventually drawn. But here g6 was played, and now c3 from Caruana. a4 happened in one of the other Dominguez games, so maybe that proves that Caruana didn't prep this with Dominguez, because Dominguez played a4, which seems to be the best try. But that game also ended in a draw. It was Dominguez against Anand, from 13 years ago. And then, yeah, it ended in a draw. So c3 was played, knight a5. And here, actually, on move 24, rook e2, this is the first new move of the game. There was another game here that continued king c2 between a 2380 IM and Le Quang Liem, actually, from 11 years ago. So this is quite a played out position, which is again why it's a little surprising that Caruana went for this, because it seems like Duda was well prepared and sort of got a pretty equal position pretty easily with black. I should also mention that Le Quang Liem won that game with black. So maybe if anyone has the chances here, you could argue it's black. Anyway, so king f6 was played, h4, knight b7, rook e d2, knight c5. We get some shuffling around, a trade. Here, I would almost say that maybe black is ever so slightly better, because they can always play for f5, e4, and black has a much clearer path to creating a passed pawn than white does on the king side here. Sorry, on the queen side, because things are just pretty locked up. It's just hard for white to create a passed pawn. There's no clear path. But nothing much happens. We get another rook trade. both players try to maximize the position of their pieces. We get some more pawns traded off the board. Temporarily, Caruana's down a pawn, but pretty much everything gets traded off here, and we get a draw. So a pretty solid game. Some thought, including myself, that Caruana would have good chances to win this game with the white pieces and maybe press a little harder, get more of an edge out of the opening. But, you know, it happens. Obviously, all these players are incredibly strong. So, yeah, I mean, Caruana just didn't get very much in this game. All right, so now on to the next one. This game, Ding versus Rapport, that I teased a bit earlier. So this was a Grunfeld. Actually, to my surprise, when I looked at the database, Rapport has never played the Grunfeld before. And that's not to say that he hasn't played it at all. I'm sure he's played it in training games or online games. You know, I don't think you really play anything in the candidates without having some experience in it. But in the past, all of Rapport's games in the database have continued Bishop G7, the King's Indian. So anyway, in this game he chose the Grunfeld. Rapport has also had several games on the white side of the Grunfeld, by the way, just not on the black side. So we got pretty standard stuff here. Ding plays Bishop C4, which he has actually never played before. In the past, he's sometimes played Bishop E3 or Knight F3. He had a game against Nepomniachtchi where he played Bishop E3. But Bishop C4 is perfectly playable. It's one of the main moves. C5, Knight E2, and white tends to go for the setup. You want to solidify this pawn structure, and even though the knight is defending C3, you still never really take on C5. It's just been proven that black has enough counterplay there. So castles B6, rook C1 was played, bishop B7, bishop B5, rook C8, queen D2, take, and here queen D6 was played by Rapport, which is sort of an uncommon move. Here, most of the games played have continued E6. There was a Yu Yangyi game versus MVL that continued as such, with Yu Yangyi playing a quick H4 and trying to attack on the king side. But in this game, queen D6 was played. And this move sort of baits D5. I mean, if black's not going to go E6, D5 makes perfect sense. And I think this is probably fine, but I think Ding assumed that Rapport had some deep preparation here and that maybe D5 was wrong, because, you know, you probably don't allow this if it's a very strong move. And it does sort of overextend, because if knight e5, f4, the knight is chased to g4, which is a pretty reasonable square, and now black is ready to start trying to break up the center. So Ding didn't go for that. He played rook fd1. And here queen b4 was played, the first novelty. There was a blitz game on Lichess between Sinan Shugirov, who's close to 2700, and a 2300, who actually also played this queen b4 idea. And honestly, I'm a little curious to know if maybe Rapport was inspired by this game or found this game in the database to go for this queen d6, queen b4 idea, because it seems like it's not so common. It's definitely not played in a lot of games. So, you know, it would definitely be interesting to know how much these top players borrow from some random master games in the database, and sort of how far they go, like how deep they go in looking for ideas. But anyway, Rapport played queen b4 right away. We got queen d3, e6, and now h4. And this is sort of in the spirit of the Yu Yang Yi game that we talked about earlier. So rook fd8, and here bishop g5 was played. And this sort of takes advantage of this rook maybe being a little awkwardly placed. And you don't really want to play f6 here because now your pawn structure is just a little weak. Could be the target of some sort of h5 in the future, or just some bishop c4 to put pressure on e6, for instance. So Rapport made a very interesting decision here to take on d4. And yeah, I mean, he's just giving up an exchange, but he's sort of saying now that, you know, black has some compensation, 2 bishops, as Ben Feingold would say, what else? But also, it's just hard to break up black's pieces. You don't really ever want to take on d4, because then you're allowing black's pieces to swoop in, and e4 is also loose. You know, additionally, you also have to be careful that this bishop doesn't hang at some point. Right now, it's not hanging due to tactics on the d-file, but it could be an issue. Here, probably the best approach was bishop a6, just trying to trade some pieces. And if you get a position like this, white's extra exchange should probably decide the game and give them a winning endgame. But understandably, Ding played the fairly natural move here, h5. I mean, when you play h4, you usually also play h5, unless your opponent plays h5 and stops you. So, yeah, that's just kind of how modern chess is nowadays. So here bishop e5 was played, which is a good move. Knight c6 is kind of natural, unleashing this rook. But white can play a move like queen c4, and then they're just completely fine. And you could also try rook d6. Now you are threatening to take this bishop. But after trades, and, you know, rook d4, white can maybe slide their queen out of the way, and you have to be careful about queen b8. So if bishop d4, now queen g3, if black tries to grab this pawn, there's the nice move h6, taking advantage of back rank ideas. And, you know, to add another layer, these bishops are also loose. There's going to be moves like rook c4, taking advantage of that. So basically, black is in big trouble here. So bishop e5 is a precise move. And here, a4 is played. And I should also mention that h6 here is not possible because of a very nice maneuver, queen f8. And now suddenly the h6 pawn hangs, and black might even be better, because now the queen is eyeing h2, and this spells trouble. So you can't do that. So Ding played a4, defending his bishop, king g7, and now king f1. And this is a very nice move from Ding. I found this very impressive. The computer was screaming for this move to be played. It is the best computer move by quite a bit, but it's not obvious why. And you have to have a very deep understanding of chess to know why king f1 is so strong. Basically, you're stepping out of knight takes e2 check. And furthermore, you're threatening rook c4. So in, you know, actuality, the idea is quite simple, but king f1's just such an unnatural move, you don't really consider it. So knight takes e2, queen takes e2 was played. And here Ding had basically a chance to win the game. Queen takes d8 is pretty much game over. But it's not so obvious why. It's still very complicated. So here, knight takes c1 can be played, and now there's the only winning move, queen to g5, which hits this bishop and threatens h6 and rook d8 mate. So basically black has to go knight d3 to block that checkmate idea, But now h6 and rook d3, and you're once again threatening checkmate. Basically, black's king is just too weak, and white's up in exchange. This is over. And if queen takes e4 in this position, trying to go for counterplay with queen takes g2, there's bishop takes e2, and now queen takes g2, king e1. If queen g1, then there's some multiple ways you can play king d2, but the cleanest way is bishop f1. And now bishop a6, there's h6, queen h4, and queen h3, and the queen gets back. I should also mention, if in this position, if black tries bishop g2, I mean, there's a number of moves. For instance, probably simplest is queen d3. You can also like move the king. King e2 should also win. And if queen h1 here, king d2, bishop f4, something like this was probably what Ding was most worried about, because here this just looks very dangerous. The king is getting chased, and the computer recommends king c3 here. And, you know, I'm not going to get too deep into the complications, but basically white should escape with the extra material and be winning. But it is very complicated. And so Ding plays queen takes e2. He's still up in exchange. Here Rapport plays a6, which is actually a little imprecise. He should probably go bishop d4. And one idea here is to just go e5 and lock this bishop in on a very strong square. It also makes white's rook look stupid on d1 because, you know, it's no longer controlling an open file. So a6 was played, and now after a trade, e4 falls, and we get a trade on g6, and here Ding needed to find a critical move, which is the move queen to e2. Now, basically this gives white enough time, because they're putting pressure on the bishop, to play king g1 and g3. And once you get this set up, your king is very safe, and now you can focus on playing rook d7 and activating your rook, as well as targeting this weak b6 pawn, which is actually very hard for black to defend. But instead in the game, Ding plays rook e1, and now queen d4 is played. And now queen e2, bishop f6, queen e4. But, you know, again, you can see a big difference here is, first of all, this rook is just not getting active. And that's sort of an issue. For now, I mean, as long as this rook doesn't get to an open file, you could argue that it's not any better than black's bishop. So queen d2 is played, rook e2, Ding repeats, and then plays g3, and now bishop d4, and queen e2, queen c3, rook d1. This is sort of the last straw, you could say. And now Rapport finds a precise move, queen c6. Now suddenly black's threatening queen h1 checkmate. Also, they're just threatening to take on a4. And these dual threats mean that white just no longer has an advantage, because if they lose a4, then black has 2 pawns for the exchange, including a passed pawn. And there black is drawing at least, which is why here queen g4, and Rapport plays e5, defending his bishop. Queen a4 is unstoppable now. So Ding just sacks the exchange back, and we get a draw because it's equal material. So Ding missed a big chance there to get to an even score. If you remember, he lost his first game to Nepomniachtchi. But, okay, Ding is still in it. So if you're a Ding fan, then don't worry. Yeah. Rapport lives to fight another day. All right. Now let's get into this last game here of the round, which is Firouzja versus Nakamura. It went d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4, so a Nimzo Indian. And here when I looked at the database, it seemed like Firouzja was often playing the f3 Nimzo, which is a super sharp Nimzo line. and there's potential for some very dynamic positions here. But Firouzja decided not to go for that in the candidates, and he played queen c2, which he's actually only played once before, according to ChessBase. So castles, a3, take, d5. The one game that Firouzja played continued d6 a couple years ago against a 2000, so not a very critical game. But Nakamura played d5. We got bishop g5. Here Nakamura played takes. c5 is also a move, but this is what Nakamura tends to go for. We got some more pretty standard moves. And here the first surprise was queen c2. And Nakamura said after the game that he wasn't expecting this. This isn't something he's ever faced before. And in general, it just hasn't been played very much. There are plenty of games here with e3. Rapport played this against Nakamura in St. Louis last year. Liem played e4 against Nakamura in St. Louis last year as well. So those are two main moves, but queen c2 was played, c5, and now e4. So the idea of queen c2 is you're preparing e4 by defending the e4 pawn. And here bishop f1 was played. And now white has a choice. They can take with the king or the rook. And both are very logical. Firouzja is white. Firouzja decided to play rook takes f1. And now g5 was played. And this is sort of a provocative move. Now, if white plays a move like bishop g3, which was played in an online game, a game entitled Tuesday between two lower-rated title players, now black has quite a significant advantage. Basically, white's king is in the center, and that's going to be an issue. But in this game, Firouzja went for knight takes g5, which is a novelty, and a strong one. This idea has been played, though, in other games, including Liem's game against Nakamura. So here we got take. Now Firouzja is down a piece, but it's a very sharp position, and he has ideas like e5 and ways to try to get the rook into the game and the queen as well. So here knight c6 was played. e5 is reasonable to stop white from playing e5, but after d5, rook d6, rook d3, Nakamura said he was kind of worried about this, which is logical considering white is going to bring their rook to one of these squares. There's also an idea of f4, and basically you just have to be very passive. There's not an easy way to untangle this for black. And you can see the computer gives equality. So that's how you know that white has a lot of compensation for the piece here. So knight c6, and here Firouzja played the move queen c1, preparing to bring the queen to f4. And he played this very quickly. So Firouzja was clearly still in preparation. Here e5 is also a move. After take queen d3, we might get something like this. And then there might be some trade. Black has rook d8. They also have queen b7 and taking on g2, which is very interesting. So it's definitely unclear. But Firouzja probably looked here with computers on a pretty deep depth and decided that this was the best move. So here Nakamura plays rook takes d4, which is pretty reasonable. There are a lot of interesting lines here. So c takes d4 is possible, and if queen takes c6, here there's just rook c8, and now black is actually fine. They can play e5 at some point and maybe start to unravel their pieces. There's also rook c5 coming. So probably queen f4 is the most logical move then, and if king g7, e5. And now black has to be really careful because knight h5 runs into queen g4, knight e5, bishop f6. And if queen takes h5 here, then black can go f6 and they're probably fine. But this bishop f6 move is very nice, and now white will pick up the queen. And if knight d5 here instead of knight h5, white just simply goes queen g3, and now a lot of stuff is lined up. There's going to be some sort of discovered check, and black is going to lose. So c takes d4 is an option. Another option is knight takes d4, but now queen f4, and there's no clear continuation for black. If they play knight c2, white's going to simply play king e2, and knight d4 is met by takes, and then takes on f6. So here probably the best move for black is e5. And now after d5, black has knight d4. And so here if f4, there's just rook d6, and black seems to be holding everything here. And white is actually the one who's getting in trouble because their king is opening up. So white should probably try rook d3 to lift the rook. But now after queen d6, rook h3, there's a very nice line here. I'm not sure that Nakamura saw this in the game. It's definitely not easy. But the idea here is knight takes e4. And now after takes, white should play f3 here, because otherwise black's pieces are getting very active. They're going to start to have threats. So white should try to kick these knights out, or at least the e4 knight. But now black can take on d5, because after take, here queen f5, white won't be able to prevent a perpetual. So if king g1, there's knight e2 check, this queen is hanging, so that's not possible. And on a move like king e1 or king e3, there are going to be checks with knight c2 or queen g5, and essentially black has a perpetual. So e5 probably would have led to a pretty quick draw. But rook takes d4 is played, and now rook takes d4, knight takes d4, queen f4, and here Nakamura had some options. He said he looked at queen d7, and here there's a very forcing line, which a lot of the commentators showed. So takes knight c2, queen b5, and here, amazingly, the black king is actually not getting checkmated. It feels like it should be with this queen and bishop, but in fact, the black king is running out, and now white will give some checks. They can take the rook, but then after queen takes f2, everything's just going to get traded, basically. So they give a bunch of checks, and now take on c2. And here white is down in exchange, but they have a ton of pawns, and black's king is very weak. And here, according to the computer, rook f8 is roughly equal, but I think that's very difficult to see. And, you know, I mean, this is, after all, like a 9-move line. Even for these guys that are in the candidates, it's very hard to calculate that deep. So, and here, actually, after queen takes f2, the natural move, white is better after king b3, because there are all kinds of checkmate ideas against this king. So Nakamura instead chose in this position to play knight c2, and now king d1, queen d7, king c2, queen a4, king b1, and here we get this endgame. And basically black is a little worse. White has a bishop for a knight. They also have a passed h-pawn, which could be a factor in the long term. Basically, white's 3 versus 2 on the king side is a little stronger than black's 3 versus 2 on the queen side. Black should be trying to trade pawns on the queen side so as to eventually create a passed pawn. And here, Firouzja, instead of king b1, could have played b3. And the reason that this is a little worse is that it makes it easier for black to trade pawns and create a passer. So we got this, knight f6, h4, knight d5, bishop d2, f5, and now Nakamura is trying to take space, threatening an idea of f4, like f3, f4, for instance, and now the pawns are fixed. So white will have trouble making any progress with the pawn structure. So g3 is played here, king f7, f3, and now rook h8, preventing g4 because h4 would hang. So bishop g5 is played, renewing the idea of g4. And here Nakamura made a slight inaccuracy with c4. He should have played the move e5, and now g4, king e6. And you can see that if a trade happens, then the king and the rook should basically cover the h-pawn pretty well. If h5, now a move like knight f6, and things are liquidating pretty quickly. Black is threatening to take on g4, rook g8 could be coming, and there's going to be a lot of pressure on these pawns. So c4, g4 was played here, and we got b5, rook d1, takes, a5, h5. Here, rook g8 was played. b4 is another option, but after rook f1, king g7, and a move like bishop c1, it feels like these pawns could be very dangerous. At least that's what Nakamura said after the game. So that was why he played rook g8, and now rook f1, king e8, and h6. And rook f8 was played here. So it's very natural to trade, and it feels like there should be a win, because white has two connected passed pawns, and the bishop, which is usually stronger than the knight, especially when connected with passed pawns. But in this case, it actually turns out to be a draw. And the winning move here is rook h1. And now after king f7, trying to cover the pawns, the bishop drops back to d2. And now after the move b4, there's rook f1 and rook c1. And the c4 pawn actually can't be defended, which is a pretty remarkable idea. So Firouzja instead plays the natural move and takes on f8. But as it turns out, this endgame is a draw, and black has to be precise, but king f7's played. The king is going to cover these pawns, so Firouzja tries to get the pawns even further. But this turns out to be a draw here. And it's important to be precise. A move like e5 actually loses, because white will eventually be able to sneak their king around to e4. So the critical idea here is c3. And now we get a trade. And basically what black is going to do is they're going to play e5 here. So now when white tries to bring their king closer, there's knight f4. And then g6 is going to fall. And you can't take on f4 actually, because then black would be winning, because they'd have the passed f pawn, and they can play b4 and create a passed a pawn. So knight f4 is a big issue, which means that, in fact, black is completely fine here. And otherwise, black can just wait with their king. They can't play knight f4 now because of bishop f6. They can only play it when it's with check. But that means that white will never be able to bring their king in. There's just no way to get it done without allowing knight f4 check. Or if you somehow bring the king around this way, for instance, then black will be able to go b4 and create a passed pawn, and that could also be dangerous. So essentially, black is just barely in time to hold a draw, and that's exactly what happens here. King e1 is played, but now b4. And I should mention, if king g7, now white is actually getting their king around via f1, and now king f2, and now king f3, and the king will get to e4. And actually, I'm not really sure why king f2 here fails, but I guess the king needs to be, maybe from f1, the king somehow covers... Oh, I think I know. I think it's because here b4 a3, bishop c1, knight b4 should draw, and from f1 it's preventing some knight d3 check idea, basically. Anyway, so that's kind of complicated. But anyway, b4 was played, and now a b4, a3, bishop c1, and knight b4. And if you take on a3, there's knight c2 check. So Firouzja tries king d2, but now knight d5 is played, bishop a3, knight f4, and all the pawns come off the board, and the game is agreed a draw. So a bunch of very exciting games in this round 3, but all 4 end in draws. That's it, and I hope you enjoyed the recap. See you guys next time. Bye.